I'm super happy to be here. I'm happy for the invitation because this gives me the opportunity to talk about one of my most favorite topics, and this is trust in human technology interaction. However, at the same time, I have to admit, that I'm not a big fan of trust in human technology interaction. So I like to talk about it, but this is also why today I would like to talk in my keynote about rethinking the significance of trust in shaping user behavior with technology. So, but let's start at the beginning first. So when you look at the literature, and also when we look at this conference today, it is really widely believed that trust is important. So, and when you have a look at the literature and at some of the most cited papers, you find statements like trust, a socio-psychological concept, seems particularly be important for understanding human automation partnerships. So this is Lee and C. And also when you have a look at the paper by Hoff and Bashir about trust in human automation interaction, they state that trust plays a leading role in determining the willingness of humans to rely on automated systems. And also, last but not least, here's a statement by Peter Hancock. Here, the focus was on trust in human-robot interaction. And he states that trust is important in these contexts because it directly affects the willingness of people to accept robot-produced information, to follow a robot's suggestions, and thus benefit from the advantages inherent in robotic systems. So, trust seems to be a key for human-robot or human technology interaction because it seems to determine how people behave or interact with technology or technological systems here. So this is like the implicit assumption which is made in all these statements. Now, taking a step back, what do we mean by trust? And I know we all have already heard these definitions today in the talks that we have listened to, but just shortly, I think it is important to think about that the concept of trust is a social and psychological concept. So it stems from human relationships, and I think the most cited definition here is by Meyer, Davis, and Shorman, and they define trust as a willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation that the other will perform a particular action important to the truster, irrespective of the ability to monitor or control that party. So this is from interpersonal trust here, and now Lee and C have taken this definition, they have densed it and then translated it to human automation interaction. And I think this one is shorter, but I think the most important parts are still in there. First of all, the trust is an attitude, so it lies within the human agent. And it is an attitude that another agent, so now technology, for example, will help achieve an individual's goals in a situation. And now this is really important, that is characterized by first, uncertainty, and second, vulnerability. So first, you need uncertainty. So for example, that you do not have all the information necessary to evaluate a certain situation, because otherwise you wouldn't need to trust a system, because then you would just know about this, the situation. So trust is not necessary. You might still have a certain level of trust in the automation, but your behavior is independent of that because you have all the information you need to behave in a certain situation. So uncertainty is the first precondition for trust to become relevant for behavior. And the second part is the vulnerability. And here it is also important because it has to be something at stake for you. So that it is really something that the outcome of the decision or the outcome of the situation is important to you, because otherwise it would be irrelevant whether you trust or you do not trust the agent in this situation to support you, for example. Now, based on these definitions, and because all the other researchers have stated that trust is a super important construct in human technology interaction, we, of course, were also interested in trust in human technology interaction. And so we have conducted a lot of studies on trust in human-machine interaction. here, for example, we did studies, these were experimental studies where people came to our lab and then they had to work as operators on this multitasking environment. For example, this was the simulation of a cabin air management system. So the operator was responsible for a space station. So very important task here, but still, of course, we had students in the lab. They were working on this multitasking simulation, and we varied, for example, the stage of automation. So they always had this automation support here, decision support system. We varied the stage of automation, or we varied the reliability of this decision support system. And of course, we were interested how this reflects in the people's trust in the decision support system, and also, of course, how this reflects in behavior. We did other studies. Here, for example, this was a study in human-robot interaction in an industrial setting. And here, again, we varied something very differently compared to the first study I just presented. So here we varied the anthropomorphic appearance of the robot. So because we thought maybe when it has like eyes, it looks more familiar, so people will be more trusting towards the robot. And this, of course, should also be reflected in the trust attitude and also in the behavior in interaction with this robot. So very different scenario here. We also assess trust in virtual reality environments. So this is again very immersive. So we had people come to our lab, and again, they had to do a lot of different tasks. I will go into detail to that later on in my talk, and they still were supported by decision support system. And again, we varied the reliability or the stage of automation of this decision support system. And last but not least, we also conducted online studies. I think we all did because of Corona. So now we are experts in online studies. And here, for example, we were interested how explainability of an AI support system changes people's trust and behavior in interaction with this decision support system. So this was a discrete choice experiment here as an online study. So why am I telling you all that? So this is just like a really very short overview of some of our research here, because now the question comes, did we find evidence for the relevance of trust? And unfortunately, I have to say no, because we couldn't find any evidence for a coherence between trust attitude and trust behavior in these studies. So irrespective of the specific manipulations I just told you, so we varied the reliability of a system, the stage of automation support, we varied the appearance of a robot, so very different kinds of manipulations, explainability. This was already a talk today. We varied a lot of different manipulations here. And we had a lot of different experimental settings. So maybe online studies with embodied robots in the lab or multitasking simulations. And irrespective of all this, we either found that in these studies, trust attitude was affected, but not trust behavior. Or we found that trust behavior was affected, but not trust attitude by these manipulations. Or we found that both were affected, so yay, but unfortunately not in the same direction. So this really gave us a hard time in interpreting our results here. But we were not the only ones who have these problems, because when you have a look into the state of the art with regard to research, there are numerous studies that show that various manipulations often impact either trust attitude or trust behavior, or they even found that there is no coherence between the constructs at all. And again, others find that we have an impact of manipulations on trust attitude and trust behavior, but in the opposite direction of the expected effects. So this is kind of a problem here. But of course, this is just one part of the story, because on the other hand, of course, there is evidence in favor of a relationship between trust and behavior. So a lot of studies find strong correlations between trust attitude and behavior. However, you have to be careful with this, because these are just correlations, so you cannot draw conclusions about the predictive power of trust as an attitude for subsequent behavior here. But still, for example, Muir and Murray found that trust attitude significantly predicts the behavior, and they found that in conducting some regression analysis. And in this paper, Muir and Murray, they state that the regression is consistent with conventional wisdom in the field and with our own intuition in everyday situations that trust determines people's use of automation. And I think this latter statement I cited here, this is the most important aspect why we still trust the trust concept. Because for us, it seems extremely logical and also intuitive that the magnitude of how much I trust the system will predict how much I will use and rely on it. So this is more like from our own understanding and this conventional wisdom. And I think this is like more or less the most important point because it seems so intuitive to us. But let's face this more in a more structured way. So when you look at the studies, and also when you look at the conceptual models on trust and automation, for example, the model we just heard about that was presented by Johannes Kraus earlier this morning, I think when you want to like dense all the information, all the models and all the studies assume explicitly or implicitly something like that here. So you have an input, so these are the perceived system properties. This can be the reliability of a system or the appearance of a robot or whatever, you name it. So anything which is as an input from the system. And this perceived system properties then influence the trust attitude of a person. So how much do you trust this system? And the trust attitude in turn then influences the subsequent behavior in the interaction, which I call trust behavior here. So when you have a look at this, we talk about a mediation here. So this mediation can also be structurally conceptualized like this. So the effect of the system properties will have an indirect effect on the behavior via the trust attitude. Now, in case of a perfect mediation, so if trust attitude was really super important and shaping the trust behavior, this direct path C that you can see here, so from the perceived system properties to trust behavior, would not be significant when trust attitude and path A and path B are added to the model. So, but to be less strict here, at least path A and path B should be significant if you wanted to call it mediation, which would then speak for the relevance of trust in human technology interaction. So do studies find these paths? No. So the few studies that did in fact investigate trust attitude and trust behavior in mediation models did not. So here, for example, in a study by Bustamante, he used structural equation modeling with data from 2 separate experiments, and the result was there was no significant B path. As you can see, this is missing here. And the author's conclusion was that trust attitude and trust behavior might be related, but simply as a byproduct of the type of automation here. So the manipulated system properties in this case was the error bias in both studies, and this was whether the automation was either false alarm or error prone. Then there was another study by Wieczorek and Mansa in 2010, and they also conducted a path analysis, and this time they varied the system properties by manipulating the automation's reliability. And again, this B path, so from trust attitude to compliance, was not found. Again, there was no mediation here. And also the same results were found in 2 studies by Chansey et al. However, they also did experiments in which they did find this mediation. But still, it is important to note that even though they did find the mediation, it was extremely small. So there was an extremely small effect size, but still a mediation here. So in summary, we can say that when you have a look at studies that really conducted these mediation analysis, and there are only a few of them, the majority of these studies actually did not find a mediation. So the relevance for trust attitude is still in question here, or even more in question based on these findings. So now we could say, maybe we can just discard trust for our research in human technology interaction. But before we do that, we have to rethink how we conduct the studies, because when you have a look at the definition of trust in human technology interaction again, there is this part of the vulnerability. Now, when you have a look at the studies, so these are the studies we conducted here in the lab. So people, most of them students, are sitting in front of a computer screen, or they are in the lab and they are working with a robot. But of course, we have everything is safe and they know they are in a very artificial surrounding. And when you compare this to the real world, it is very obvious that there is a big difference between the situation of a pilot at work and that of a participant in one of our simulation studies. And that is the risk associated with mistakes. So in fact, in our laboratory studies and also in online studies, of course, there is no real vulnerability of the participants. And maybe this is the important part in the definition and also in research. So this might be the missing piece here. So is risk the missing piece? So is this the reason why we never found in the lab studies this mediation from perceived system properties over trust attitude to trust behavior? Because people were just didn't care. So it was not relevant whether they trusted the automation or not, because they just behaved so that they can leave the laboratory as fast as possible, so because there was nothing at stake for them. So we were really interested in this. So is risk the missing piece here? And so we wanted to do some research on that. And there we had the next challenge, because how can you introduce risk still in an ethical way into an experimental setting? So we couldn't really hurt our participants. Yeah, so we had a problem here. We were thinking about that a lot, and then we came up with a virtual reality paradigm, and it is called the virtual reality testbed for risk and automation studies, in short, VIRTUS. This was developed by, or there are also 2 studies on that by Hüsrey and myself. So these are the validation studies, because first and foremost, it was important to show that we can really manipulate risk here. And we did that by the altitude in which participants or operators have to work in. So, but first, the cover story of this VR paradigm is set in the not so distant future, where humans began to build information networks on other planets. So it's extraterrestrial. Now, the subject is an operator in a prototype of such a system you can see here. And the operator's task is to do some maintenance work on the system, because sometimes the information clouds you can see here as the yellow ovals there, they get stuck. And then the operator has to travel to the part of the information network in this little capsule there. And then they have to reset the information cloud manually. So this is the cover story. Now, to do the job, so to reset the information cloud manually, you can subdivide this task into 3 subtasks. So because you're an extraterrestrial planet, you first of all have to diagnose the atmospheric condition, because this is important. It changes a lot depending on where you are on the planet, and it can be detrimental for the capsule and also a ramp you have to cross when you want to do the manual reset of this information cloud. So first of all, you have to do the diagnosis, then you have to decide whether you have to apply an appropriate protective alloy. So if this is necessary or not, and if it is necessary, what kind of alloy. And then you can step outside of the capsule. You have to cross a ramp. This is 3 meters walk, and then you can manually reset the information cloud and turn back into the capsule. Now, the first 2 steps we used to implement an automation support system here. It's called ATS, or ATS, Atmospheric Testing System in English. And the 3rd step, so then when you have to walk out of the capsule and cross this ramp, this is where what we use to manipulate our risk here. Now, first, to test this mediation, or this moderated mediation, what we did was we varied the perceived system properties now, and we varied the reliability of the system, so of this automation support. So this is a screenshot of this decision automation support, and this was either 60% reliable or it was 90% reliable. Then trust attitude, how did we measure this? And because we were so interested in this, we used a lot of studies here, measures here. So first of all, we used the most often used trust attitude questionnaire with one global trust factor. And this is the trust and automation scale by Jian et al. Then we also used a single trust item, because this is the second most often used way to measure trust as a single trust item. And we also used a multidimensional trust questionnaire. So to see if one of these, because there are different conceptual ideas behind these questionnaires, whether you think it's just one global trust factor, for example, or if there are multiple dimensions that are important for trust. So we wanted to have all of them to see whether one of these trust assessments is valid to predict trust behavior. I can already spoiler, for all three trust measures, we had the same results. And this is why I will just talk about results for the trust and automation scale, but it's the same for the others. Now, the trust behavior, we operationalized this as the information sampling. So when the decision support system gave you a diagnosis, you had to verify this diagnosis. So to be sure whether the diagnosis of the automation was correct or not. So, and here we calculated the information sampling as the assessed necessary parameters to know whether the automation is correct or not, to the amount of necessary parameters. So this means when you trust the automation, you do not sample all necessary information. So you leave uncertainty there. So lower ratings of information sampling are an indicator for higher trust, higher behavioral trust. Higher or more information sampling is an indicator for lower trust here. And then we had the risk, and this was varied via the altitude, and we had a risk and a no risk condition. So in the risk condition, participants had to cross the ramp 70 meters above the ground. So this was really high. And if they made a mistake, the ramp could crack and they could virtually fall. And I can tell you, because the VR simulation was very immersive, you really didn't want to fall. So this was not very pleasant. And then we had a no risk condition. And this was that participants worked on this task just half a meter above the ground and the ramp couldn't break. So when they made a mistake, it was just told that this is not very good, because then it's a waste of resources. So this was the only consequence when they had made a mistake here or not. So to summarize, the proposed mediation model was tested using this operationalization. So we had the reliability as a trust attitude measure. We had the trust and automation scale by Jian and all the others. We had information sampling as trust behavior, and risk we manipulated as being present or absent. So let's take a look at the results. And first of all, I'd like to show you a simple mediation for the no risk group. And this is interesting because this is then how most of the studies before have realized this. So this is very comparable with all the studies that did not include risk in their research. So what we can see is that we have a significant direct effect of reliability on trust attitude, and also a significant direct effect on trust behavior. However, there is no indirect effect. So the confidence interval covers 0 here, and there is no significant B path. So clearly no mediation again. And that, although, and this is interesting, we have a substantial and significant correlation of trust attitude and trust behavior. So this is what most studies report as evidence for the predictive power of trust attitude on trust behavior. So we have a really strong correlation here, but it is not predictive. What about the risk group? So again, here we find a significant effect of reliability on trust attitude, but then again, there is no other significant path here. And this again, although we find a significant correlation between trust attitude and trust behavior. So these correlations are always negative because the higher the trust, the less information you sample. So this is why it is a negative correlation here. Now, what happens when I put both groups together and specify risk as a moderator of path B? So because we were thinking this might be the missing link here. So statistically, this is conceptualized like this. So just that you do not wonder when you see the results in the model here. And again, what we find is that we have a significant direct effect of reliability on trust attitude, and we also have a significant direct effect on trust behavior. However, again, there is no mediation, despite the correlation of trust attitude and trust behavior. So to conclude, there is a total effect from perceived system properties. In this case, this was reliability to trust attitude, and there is also a total effect to trust behavior. But there is no mediation. And consequently, risk cannot moderate this missing mediation. So we have to discard this model. However, the model seems to look more like this because we found that risk indeed moderates the relationship, but it moderates both paths from perceived system properties to trust attitude, and also the path from perceived system properties to trust behavior. So to conclude, are trust attitude and trust behavior related? Definitely yes, because other studies before us, but also this study I just presented, we found large and significant correlations between both concepts. However, I mean, this adds even more doubt on earlier studies' interpretation as an evidence for a causal effect here, because this is clearly not the case. So is trust attitude a relevant construct to predict behavior? Apparently not. So trust attitude is not the cause of trust behavior. Is risk a moderator? Yes, but not of the mediation. So the idea that trust plays such a key role in human technology interaction because it is the precondition for trusting behavior, I think this is just not the case. So should we discard trust then for human technology interaction research? And here again, I have to clearly say no. Because from a psychological perspective, of course, this concept of trust is still important for people's well-being and also for work design. So from especially a psychological and also ethical perspective, we still have to talk about this. But do not use it as a predictor for behavior. And also, when you want to do research on trust in human technology interaction, I really want to encourage you to not just report correlations, because this is not appropriate, but really use statistical analyses that allow to investigate the temporal and causal relationship of inputs and outputs. So use mediation models, use path analysis or structural equation modeling. So for the latter, I know you need quite big sample size. So this might be a problem when you do laboratory experiments, but for example, mediation models you can always do. So this is not a problem at all. And please stop to use excessively self-reported trust for research. And I mean, if at all, there was this only the single study that found that there is a mediation, but even in this study, the effect was really pretty small here. And think about measuring what arguably matters most. So do not stop when you have like your inputs, perceived system properties, then you have the trust attitude. Do not stop here. Please always also consider assessing behavior, because this is what matters most. This is where we want to go, that we want to have an appropriate or intuitive or efficient, whatever, satisfying human technology interaction. So really measure this interaction in terms of behavior. Furthermore, what I think could also be an interesting way to go, and there are already some efforts here, try something new. So instead of using trust questionnaires, and I know it's very comfortable because you can just like hand it to the participants. They can just like make their statements. It's super easy. It's super efficient, but maybe it's not the right way. So when you want to measure trust in human technology interaction research, there are different approaches to objectively measure trust. So, for example, there are already studies out there that try to measure trust with eye tracking data. There are other studies that use physiological measures like heart rate dynamics. And last but not least, I think this is very interesting. There's also a study by Lee and colleagues from the last year. They used conversational data, including, for example, lexical and acoustic features of speech, to make inferences on participants' trust in the interaction with a conversational agent. So with these ideas, I'd like to conclude. These are my references of the talk, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd like to especially thank Steffen Hösterei, who developed together with Markus Arendt the virtual reality paradigm, and also did the moderated mediation analyses as part of his PhD project. So without Steffen, I couldn't have held this talk today. So I owe him a lot of gratitude. Thank you very much here. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. That is a little bit more up my alley. So it's very nice to be chairing this session. I sometimes feel a little bit out of my depth. I focus obviously much more on the human side, but I'm going to jump right in because in my group we've been having obviously very very difficult discussions on how to measure trust if you're measuring trust, and I'm just going to jump straight into obviously one of the later slides on the objective measures of trust, because obviously something that I'm interested in is what facilitates creating a bond, which may be called trust. So determining whether it's a threshold thing. So one is threshold. Is it that you have to reach a certain level of physiological coupling? Is it that you have to, kinematically speaking, couple at a motor level to a certain degree, and now all of a sudden you've reached that threshold and therefore you can feel connected. So one is, based on these objective measures, is it that there's a threshold of coupling that is a marker of having achieved a contract of trust? And then my other question, which is equally tricky, so I'm sorry to give you the tough questions, but I'm sure you have good answers for them. The other is causality. So one of the things I work on is dynamic coordination in groups, and there is an assumption that people who don't necessarily know each other or trust each other can coordinate. But that once they have entered into a higher level of cohesion or stronger bonds, and that again may or may not be trust, who knows, that can facilitate coupling across multiple levels. And it's only within those trusting contexts, mother and child, just to remind everybody that I had a sick baby on my shoulder earlier today, it's only in those safe, trusting contexts that you will actually have coupling across the levels. So from heart rate all the way up to semantic and back again. So I sort of have the two questions. One is, if you're deciding that objective measures are the way to go, when do you know that you've hit trust? Is there a threshold? And the other is causality, because I assume that you might need coupling to facilitate trust, but trust may also facilitate greater coupling.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Very tough questions, I have to admit. So the first, or to try to give you some thoughts on the first one, I think this is like not only with objective measures of trust, that this is a real challenge. So when do you have trust? What is appropriate trust? Because all the research, at least I know, is that we just can say that people trust the system more or less. And also in human relations, we can just say they trust another party more or less compared to another party. So this is why we always, in all our study designs, we have control groups, So because we need a reference, and every study makes its own reference there, because there are no absolute levels. And I think it's really interesting that you now say, I think it's an interesting thought that maybe we do not have like more or less, but maybe that there is a threshold, so that it is more like a binary decision. So no trust, trust. So, and of course, this is one of the toughest challenges, I think, because I mean, in all the models, we say trust is important, but then we also know there is like complacency, over-reliance, etc. But we also do not want that people do not use systems, but we cannot, this is all relational. So we cannot say what is appropriate, or we cannot define KPIs, for example, where we say this is appropriate, we want this one. So, and I think this is a problem that you have with subjective measures of trust. This is a conceptual problem, and this is also why I think it will translate also to objective measures of trust. So, and I think the only way to go here is to define your levels of trust, what you think is appropriate, by using control groups, for example, or reference groups, where you know that the behavior or the trust attitude is too low or too high, for example. So because I think it's easier to say what is not appropriate than to say what is appropriate. So that you use this as reference, or to say that it's just that you define it operationally. So that this is also what we do in our studies, that we say we want to have appropriate trust, but we tell people you have to always verify the automated diagnosis. So we know when they do the verification process, so they have a look at all the relevant parameters, we would say this is appropriate. But this is an operational definition. And I think this is what most people will do, because there is nothing where we can say conceptually, we would say this is appropriate trust, for example. And this is also what you said with your threshold, which I think is a very interesting idea, that you just for yourself, you have in a specific study with a specific context, you can define a threshold, and then you can say, this is trust, this is not trust. So this would be my thoughts for your first question. And the second question, just had some thoughts on that, but now I just forgot.
It was about causality. So just again, an idea, and I'll maybe just also mention that Verena Kloos, a previous speaker, thanks you for your talk, and she sort of highlights again one of the key outputs of the talk is that you sort of talk about trust as a bridge to behavior, to changing behavior. And so maybe you could talk about my question about causality, hooking into that with the idea being that, yes, trust can engender a certain behavior, but potentially, getting people to behave with people in a certain way can, improve, that there's this problem with causality.
Yeah, and I don't think that there is this causality that you just mentioned. So first of all, but you have to be, or I have to be a little bit differentiated here. So first of all, my talk was on subjective measures of trust, so that we use all the questionnaires. So I just can talk about this one because we just had a look into this one. But first of all, I think that trust is still important, and it might be important when you're interested in something like a general attitude, like this, when you go into the definitions and you say something like a basic willingness to engage in an interaction. Maybe it could be interesting and relevant for this one, but when you really want to use it as a predictor for specific behavior in a specific interaction, so that you really can have this prediction here, I think this will never work. So, I mean, no study to my knowledge has found this bridge. It is just not there. However, I think it is still indicative, because we know that all the studies find that trust attitude and trust behavior at the same time have high correlations. So, but I think they are a byproduct of something which is more the core of these correlations. And this is, for example, the system properties. And as you your example, you said that when people, they don't know each other, they can still coordinate, but then when they trust each other, so when there is a bond, then this translates to totally different levels of interaction, etc. And I think, yes, that is true, but this is not because of the trust, because this is a byproduct. But when people start to interact, then they gain experience and they get to know the relevant information. This is like, for example, that people they are working with are real experts, or they really have the knowledge, or I think they are super nice people, and then I trust them. But this trust is a byproduct, and at the same time this information is relevant for me, because then I can adapt my behavior to this information. But I think it's not this indirect path that you first have the relevant information, then this leads to trust or to a bond, and the bond is the relevant aspect that then leads to a better coordination. I think this is not the case. So trust is more the byproduct, and therefore it is an indicator. It's still, you can use it as an indicator, but it does not have predictive power.
Wow. Yeah, I think that certainly challenges. No, it's great. It certainly challenges a working framework that I was using. So I will reflect. But I see Johannes has his hand, so maybe he has something interesting to add.
No, I actually do not want to contradict Linda here. I really appreciate that take on trust, and I think most what Linda said I can agree on. It's really important that we actually. So that's also what I wanted to show in my talk. The complexity has to be allowed for in the end. So maybe risk is not the only moderator that is at work, right? There's the uncertainty, but also if we think from a really psychological attitude variable to behavior, this is a long way to go, and we just always have this implicit claim that trust equals behavioral decisions. This is so wrong, and this is also not how psychology works, in my view, in the end. So we have to, we're talking about bridges, but we have to build that bridge from trust to behavior and accept like the possibility that it's not explaining 80% of the variance in the end, but mainly only 10% of the variance or something like that. But it might also be something. So this is also the small point where I might a bit contradict Linda. So maybe it's still worthwhile to have a look at it in terms of predicting behavior, but not in the simple mediation way you test it. And the question is if we are even able to grasp the complexity in the end in which this relationship works, because there are so many situational variables at stake when you actually behave in a certain situation. And we are not even able to grasp that in a lab experiment, like even not with VR and even less with online studies and stuff like that. So we have to, so I would also not bury trust. I would actually say, how do you say, trust is dead, long live trust, or something like that. So I would say like we have to allow for more complexity, do more studies that actually test complex models, manipulate situational variables, and allow for complexity in the end. So
So I absolutely agree with you. So, and I think this is also like my main takeaway from the talk, or I hoped for to transfer this, that really stop oversimplifying. So because this is just what Johannes said. So just that you, and a lot of studies even don't assess trust behavior. They just stop at a trust attitude, and then they interpret that now this is super important because now people will behave in a certain way. And this is like really oversimplification. And as Johannes has just said, I absolutely agree with that, because we have so much complexity, and it is complex, and there are so many different steps between an attitude and the actual behavior. So then we also have the bandwidth fidelity dilemma here. So, you know, we have like, we ask for the general trust into the system, and then we want to have like that this really realizes or translates into a very specific behavior that the people should click on this information and this information and this information. So maybe that also does not work. So we have this problem with traits, with personality, where you always have this problem like extroversion. How should this translate to a certain click rate? So this is also a question. But at the same time, although I completely agree with Johannes, I think this is really a challenge for us as psychologists, especially as experimental psychologists, because we are always striving for simplification, because otherwise we cannot manipulate and systematically investigate these relations. And I think this will be a really great challenge here, because on the one hand, there is this need for complexity, and on the other hand, this means that we have like 10,000 confounds, and this is hard to gain knowledge then there. So, and I do not have a real solution to that. So how can we solve this new trust puzzle then? So, but maybe you have some ideas here.
Well, so what I'm always thinking of a lot in recent times is modeling it. So modeling trust with computational models, like really including more complexity. And I had the experience to actually, I had the possibility to actually experience the VR setup of Linda a few months ago. So she put me in the VR classes and let me climb the the spacecraft in which everything happens, and it's crazy. So it's really, for me, it was like really this feeling of fear, and really something bad could happen if I step on this cliff and everything. So this is really nicely done. I really like that study or the study setup in the end, and I think it's really doing something that is super important. It provides a clear method and a clear paradigm in which we are able to manipulate single variables systematically. So, and this is also like one of the key problems we are having. So we have robots in public spaces, we have industry robots, we have autonomous vehicles of different brands with different capabilities. And so all these studies investigate so profoundly different situations in the end that it's hard to like conclude all this research to some knowledge about how it actually works. So it's really important that stuff like this is done, that we put forward methods that can be used also in other labs. I don't know if you publish it, but at some point you will, I think. And then you can actually accumulate research findings in the end. And then we could use these big sets of data to actually run computational models with complexity. And I'm really looking forward to that, but it will take another 10, 20 years, maybe 10. Who knows?
Yeah, but this is also a good hit. So because you said this with the VR program, so thank you very much that you liked it so much. So this is great news. And if you're interested as a researcher to use this, so we have published a paper describing this virtuous in detail. So I think this was last year, I think, in Human Factors. Also with 2 validation studies with regard to risk perception, a behavioral and on an attitude level. And if you're interested in using this, just reach out to us. So we are happy to share this, because I also think it is very important. It would be great if there would be more research using same paradigms, because then you get comparable results. And this is really important to have really an incremental value in getting insights into human technology interaction. So just send me an email.
On that note, I want to thank you again, Linda, for the openness with which you have shared your work with us today, your ideas, and this exchange with Johannes and yourself has obviously been a highlight for the day. So I want to just thank you both very much for, putting your cards on the table, thinking about the hard questions together. This is what this event is all about. It's not just about standing up, giving your talk and walking away. It's about really having exchanges with people maybe you haven't had before, but also thinking about questions that maybe haven't popped up. I've certainly got a lot to do thinking wise. I will be coming back to you, Linda, for sure. So thank you for suggesting we can indeed reach out. I want to thank you for the great talk.